حبوبي بالوصال أنعم علي وجد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وصحابته والأكرمين تابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم فيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. How's everybody doing? Good afternoon to you all. Alhamdulillah, we will continue our study of this blessed book, ʿUlum by Hujjat al-Islam, Imam al-Ghazali, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wa nafa'ana bi-ulumihi fi ad-darain. So briefly to situate ourselves here. So this morning's session was meant to introduce Ihya and say a little bit about its author. And then to start discussing his introduction. So that discussion will continue even tomorrow morning, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. We say a little bit about the ilm, tariq al-akhirah, the science of the path to the hereafter. And Shaykh Yahya was charged in the previous session to give a very brief overview of the fadl, the merit of both knowledge, teaching, and learning. And these sections combined, were he to have gone into the detail, a lot of detail, which was not possible due to time constraints. It covers roughly 20 to roughly 30 plus pages. And Imam al-Ghazali wants us to know the honor of knowledge, the importance of knowledge, the centrality of knowledge, the foundational nature of knowledge, just as he wants us to know the most important type of knowledge that you and I should be seeking. And the next chapter, which is considered to be chapter 2, and so that again, that the order that we're doing here, because we're splicing to cover as much ground as we can, Shaykh Yahya will actually come back to cover in the next session the breakdown of the Sharia sciences that Imam al-Ghazali gives. And we intentionally left the words in Arabic on your outlines of usul, furu', muqaddimat, and mutammimat. All of that actually still considered to be chapter 1. But then in chapter 2 is where he starts to speak about beneficial knowledge. Al-ilm al-mahmud wal-madhmoom. Beneficial knowledge and blameworthy knowledge. And their various divisions, rulings, classifications. And it's here where he begins with what is known as the fard ayn. Now, I'm assuming most of you have heard this term, fard ayn. And fard ayn means that it is a fard, it is an obligation upon every ayn here, person. Ayn here refers to an actual person. So this is personally obligatory knowledge. This is the knowledge that you have to give preference to over everything else. And Imam al-Ghazali beautifully walks us through how this is. And so the reason he starts with this is because it is the first obligation upon a believer, upon someone who is a mukallaf, legally responsibility, to learn and give precedence to this knowledge. So by definition, because it comes first like this, it is the essence of what it means to be beneficial. Now, to introduce this before we actually get into what he says about this, he very beautifully in another book, and this book is called the Jawahir al-Quran wa Dururuh, the jewels of the Quran and its pearls. He talks about the main categories of verses. So after his initial statement, where he speaks of the sir of the Quran, the secret of the Quran, وَمَقْصَدُهُ الْأَسْنَى, its ultimate purpose, وَلُبَابُهُ الْأَصْفَى, its, that purest quintessence is what? To call the servants of Allah to the Lord of the heavens and the earth. And then he mentions 3 divisions of the 3 most important categories of verses. Of the 6,000 plus verses, These are the three most important categories, even though every category is, of course, important. And the first is ta'rif al-mad'u, that Allah is literally making known in His book the one that we're being called to, i.e. Himself. He's making Himself known. And one of those beautiful statements, and even though we might not be at the station where we perceive, like the great Imams did before us, it helps us even intellectually to know this exists so that we never stray from the perspective that we should have when we read the book of Allah and when we study it. And by extension, all of the sciences of the deen. That Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is known to have said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَجَلَّى لِخَلْقِهِ فِي الْقُرْآنِ وَلَكِنَّهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. Allah has made Himself known to His creation, has manifested Himself to His creation in the Quran, but they do not realize. And so the first and most important category of the Quran is to learn about Allah, His essence, which that Imam al-Ghazali says this is the hardest of categories to fully grasp. And there's only a few verses that actually point to it. Then His attributes, where He says that there's more that one can know about the attributes of Allah. And then His af'al, His acts. And essentially, everything in creation is an act of Allah. The world in which we live, all of the galaxies in our known universe, and everything that exists in the cosmos, the heavens, the earth, things that are hidden to our eye, things that we see, all of these things Allah created. And then the second major category is that the ta'rif as-sirat al-mustaqim. He wants to make known the straight path, because He said initially the whole reason the Quran was sent for human beings ultimately to come to know Allah. So first, making Allah known, making Himself known, and then defining the path to Him. التي تجب ملازمتها للوصول إليه, that you must adhere to in order to arrive to Him, يعني knowledge of Him. And then the third category is the ta'rif al-hal and al-wusul. What is the state that someone is in after coming to know Allah? And so these are the three most important categories of verses of the Quran. Now what he does, the heart of the book actually is, he pulls out from us, from the 6,000 plus verses, the first two categories. So the Jawahir al-Quran is that first category, ta'rif al-madu, and the durur, the pearls, are the second category. He doesn't list the other verses that come in the third category, nor does he list the three other categories that go along with them. And that's studied when you get a little more deeper into understanding the various classifications of verses of Allah's book. But the amazing thing that he says in this book is, when he's introducing the most important things that you need to know from the sciences of the Quran, he initially intended it to be a part of Jawahir al-Quran, but then it became a separate book, which is known as the Arba'in al-Asl, the 40 foundations. And what he says is, this knowledge, these 40 foundations, which essentially is of three categories. What we believe, what we need to believe, what we need to do outwardly, and what our state of heart needs to be. So, Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. He says, if you know these foundations, you are putting the book of Allah Ta'ala into practice. And it's just mind-blowing, it's astounding that our deen could be simplified in that way and not made to be simplistic. That you can learn your fard ayn essentially, and this is what he means. When you learn your individual obligations, and at the most basic level, you can learn them in probably 2 hours at the most basic level. You can learn everything that you need to know about the deen in that moment, in that short period of time. And then you expand for the rest of your life until you meet Allah. And sometimes we think, and people do differ, and as we will see when we get into his detailed exposition of what the fard ayn is. But when you deal with new converts, and especially those that are family members and are older, you start to realize how little actually people really need to know. I was thinking about this when my mom was needing to learn some of the basic ahkam for travel, and how it didn't require that you go through a detailed book of fiqh and this type of thing. You have to keep it simple, because she's in her mid-70s. And all you need to do, you can in about 2 minutes explain the basic rulings of prayer for travel, and that's it. That's all you need to do. Don't tell them all the complicated details and the conditions that they're never going to, just give them the absolute basics. But this is the thing, I remember Shaykh Abdul Hakim saying this about his critique of academics, is that they're so used to focusing on such a fine-tuned topic, it's very hard for them to kind of give these overviews. And the same thing happens for scholars oftentimes. They're so used to getting down to the details of the various ahkam which are needed if you're ever asked. So it doesn't mean that it's not important. But we need to be able to do that and at the same time come back here and give people what they need. And this is something I've always seen very beautiful about our teachers, because they're so immersed in a connection to the Prophet ﷺ, is that sometimes they'll answer your fiqh questions with seerah. I remember asking our teacher, Sayyid Habib one time, about that non-Muslims coming into the mosque. And he's very well aware of the different opinions, which essentially can be summarized by al-man' mutlaqan. Some say that they're just not allowed in the mosque. Others say that jawaz mutlaqan, that unconditionally allowed. And others say that with permission of Muslims. So essentially the three summarized, and there's nuances and all of that and so forth. But the point is, he said very simply, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, non-Muslims came into the Masjid of Rasulullah. What a beautiful answer. And this doesn't mean some things, because you actually have to be a master to be able to give an answer like that. But this shows how this is someone who fully understood the context. I'm from America. And that the backdrop to our interactions oftentimes with non-Muslims requires that we be hospitable, we welcome people, and it's likely that people are going to come regularly. So it was exactly the answer that you need. And it wasn't a technical answer, it was very simple. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people came into the mosque of Rasulullah. And so this is very important to be able to do this. But what an astounding thing, that if you could just spend this short amount of time learning the most important type of knowledge you need, you are putting the essence of the Quranic message into practice without knowing all of the details of what is mentioned in the Book of Allah. That is amazing. And this is such a proof that this is a universal religion. And then over time, that yes, you can learn the Arabic language, you can learn more knowledge, and you can go deeper and deeper and deeper, and that knowledge ultimately never ends. So the knowledge that is fard ayn is the knowledge that is personally obligatory. And that means is that it is an obligation for you to learn it. And so when he introduces this, he begins with the hadith of our Prophet ﷺ, طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ. That Ibn Majah narrates, seeking knowledge. And what he means by here is sacred knowledge. The basic knowledge of your deen is a faridah. It is an obligation upon every male and female believer. And it is an obligation for parents to prepare their children before they reach puberty for their taklif, for their legal responsibility. It's an obligation for parents to prepare their children for their life ahead. And if someone becomes Muslim, then there is a knowledge, as we will see, that begins. He also mentions here this beautiful hadith that has a weakness in this chain, but it's mentioned in Ihya of Abu Nu'aym, اطلب العلم ولو بالصين. Seek knowledge even in China. Many of us have heard this. And there are a number of implications there. And why he specifically mentioned this here in terms of the chapter on fard ayn, on individual obligations. This is indicating to us is that we oftentimes need to travel to do this. And this is one of the times where a child can disobey their parents. That's kind of a harsh way to put it. There's one of the times where children can, they're not bound to the restrictions of their parents, let me say. Because if you say it the other way, it could open up a door for these types of things. So if there was no one in England who could teach you the basics of your deen, then you could go to the nearest place that you could actually learn that. And that this is one of the times where a woman is not bound by her husband not wanting her to do something. Is that if he prevents her from that learning this type of knowledge, and there's other legal rulings that relate to this. But this whole idea that opening up the doors for us to travel for learning. And what a beautiful name. How many of us started here. Someone was mentioning Nottingham last night. The first place I came when I came to England in 1997, after landing in London, was Nottingham. There was the second Rihla of Shaykh Hamza Yusuf, held at the Jami al-Huda school. And what a beautiful name to name a summer program, al-Rihla. What a name. To bring to life this idea of al-Rihla fi talab al-ilm, to travel for learning, to travel for learning sacred knowledge. And it was such a beautiful experience, because I remember that, of course, Shaykh Hamza was there, but Shaykh Nuh Keller was there, Shaykh Muhammad Abu Bakr Bashu'aib was there, Shaykh Muhsin al-Najjar was there, Shaykh Abdullah al-Qadi was there. He brought a munshid from Al-Ahsa. And it was a life-changing experience, just being exposed to that. And this was early on, so like Shaykh Hamza was our fiqh teacher. He was our Arabic teacher. And it was a different stage back then. But it was life-changing. It was the first time I met Shaykh Ibrahim Osiab. He was the one who actually used to arrange the... so this is a funny story. This one's for you, Hassan. Shaykh Hassan. So... we're being quiet. I shouldn't expose myself like this. So, Mustafa Davis and I were in Mauritania, and we'd come from Mauritania, and we'd spoken to Shaykh Hamza, I think, in Spain, and he invited us. He said, "Come to the program." So when we arrived at the program, we told Shaykh Ibrahim that we were Shaykh Hamza's guests, right? Which wasn't a lie, but it wasn't like fully true either. It wasn't like he was, and. So Shaykh Ibrahim Zallah Khair, he told me that I still owe money from that. But then he goes to that Shaykh Hamza and says that, they're saying that you're his guests. He said, "No, they're not my guests. I invited them, but they're not my guests," right? Then he said that, he said about me, he says that his father has money, make him pay, right? So you have to be accepting of people that just show up out of nowhere. But it was a very blessed time, mashallah, early on into that have the imprints of that discourse on you. And I remember when shortly after that, actually it was before that, we had started studying at my local what we call junior college, which is kind of like the first 2 years of the 4-year university program. And there were some people there from a particular group that's kind of politically active. And they have like their primers where you start to learn and things like this. And we just started. And then shortly after that, we started studying with Shaykh Hamza. There was a visiting scholar from Mauritania, Shaykh Khatri al-Bayba. And we started studying the method of Ibn Ashur, which is a classic example of one of the amazing texts that covers the Fardain. It's an amazing text. By a West African scholar who's buried in Bab al-Futuh in Fez. And when we were exposed to just 1 or 2 classes, it was just like, this is it. Like, the difference between this and this was like the difference between the stars and the ground. Just tradition, subhanAllah, and everything that it contains is something that is really striking in the way that it impacts you. And transforms you. It never, no matter how much you learn, it never ceases to amaze you of what is really out there, and that how seamless and coherent this religion is, and everything that it contains. So anyhow, the Fardain, so the individual obligations, and Imam al-Ghazali then goes on to say, وَاخْتَلَفَ النَّاسُ فِي الْعِلْمِ الَّذِي هُوَ فَرْضٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ. Of course, like in many things, there are scholarly conversations and of course differences about what constitutes the individual obligations. And he then goes on to say is that oftentimes the scholars of the different sciences would tend to focus on their own discipline. And so he lists what some of the mutakallimun, what some of the fuqaha, what some of the other scholars have said about this. And Then he starts to then offer his own understanding, which this was classic Imam al-Ghazali, where he will present in that synopsis form many of the opinions of those who preceded him and bring it all together and then focus on the core part of what all of them are trying to really get at and clarify it and articulate it very clearly. And that he says here that when speaking about that the fard ayn, essentially what it really is that knowledge that pertains to what it is that we must know and do in any given time. Okay? It's that, as some people have called it, the ilm al-hal. What do you need to know in the moment? And essentially, that it relates to belief, practice, and then states of heart. So I'm going to go forward and then go back. Is that this is in a sense his ta'rif, this is his definition. Al-ilm bi-kayfiyat al-amal al-wajib. What the fard ayn is the knowledge of how to do an obligatory action. Now this pertains to the heart, because anything done in the heart is an action, even though it's done in the heart, just as it pertains to the limbs. So he said, فَمَنْ عَلِمَ الْعَمَلَ الْوَاجِبَ وَوَقْتَ وُجُوبِهِ عَلِمَ الْعِلْمَ الَّذِي هُوَ فَرْضُ عَيْنٍ. This is the khulasa, the summary. Whoever knows what is obligatory for him to do in the time that it is obligatory has known the knowledge that is personally obligatory. Okay, so then what he does here is he walks us through a broad way to understand this. So he says, وَالْمُعَامَلَةَ الَّتِي كُلِّفَ الْعَبْدَ الْعَاقِلَ الْبَالِغِ بِهَا ثَلَاثَةُ أَقْسَامٍ. So the knowledge, or the action rather, or here mu'amala would be translated as dealings, and that, in other words, is that what Allah Ta'ala that wants from us. So you could still translate this as action. That the servant who is aqil, so one of the conditions for something to be obligatory upon someone in terms of taklif, legal responsibility, is that they have aqil, is that they have intellect, and that they be baligh, is that they have reached puberty. And are three different classifications. Things that pertain to i'tiqad, which is belief, and then there's fi'l, things that we have to do, and then there's tark, then there's things that we have to avoid. So he says here, فَإِذَا بَلَغَ رَجُلَ الْعَاقِلَ بِإِحْلِامٍ أَوْ سِنٍ دَحْوَةٍ نَهَارٍ مَثَلًا. So if that young man becomes of age in any of the ways that that's happened, either by reaching a certain age or by having that one of the signs appear, that dahwat al-nahar, so in the mid-morning, for instance. He says, فَأَوَّلُ وَاجِبٍ عَلَيْهِ تَعَلَّمُ كَلِمَتَيَ الشَّهَادَةِ. The first obligation for him is to learn the two parts of the shahada, the testimony of faith. وَفَهْمُ مَعْنَاهُمَا, and understanding their meaning. What is this? He says, is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And he says here very clearly, even though this is not necessarily what you will always read in the books of Kalam, وَلَيْسَ يَجِبُ عَلَيْهِ أَن يُحَصِّلَ كَشْفَ ذَلِكَ لِنَفْسِهِ بِالنَّظَرِ وَالْبَحْثِ وَتَحْرِيرِ الْأَدِلَّةِ. It is not an obligation upon him to learn this with intellectual proofs and inquiry and the process of that investigation. وليس يجب عليه أن يحصل كشف ذلك بل يكفيه أن يصدق به ويعتقد جزما من غير اختلاج ريب واضطراب نفس. It suffices for him to believe in the realities of the shahada with firm conviction where there is no doubt. وذلك قد يحصل بمجرد تقريب السماع من غير بحث ولا برهان. And this is possible. And he says our Prophet himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam would accept the belief of the Arab, especially the Ajlaf, those who came from the desert, without learning any proofs to substantiate their beliefs. It was enough for them just to have belief. And this is really beautiful, because the vast majority of people have faith, and yes, it's good to buttress your faith with rational proofs, but there are very few people in the world that come to faith through that. And lest we forget that believing in Allah is a divine gift. It's a divine gift. And all you can do is to prepare your heart for it, but ultimately it's a divine gift. Whether you were born in Islam or whether you converted to Islam, belief is a divine gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Imam al-Ghazali has a beautiful, beautiful statement where he speaks about this reality of what faith truly is. And that essentially, that you could say faith is a light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts in the heart. And he actually goes as far to say that anyone who says that their faith is acquired through this speculative process, he's actually very critical of that. And so he says here, whoever supposes that faith is realized through speculative theology, abstract proofs, or academic divisions is an innovator. On the contrary, faith is a light that Allah, the Sublime Exalted, casts into the hearts of His servants with bounty and grace from His presence. Sometimes faith is evidenced internally as is impossible to express, sometimes through a vision while asleep, other times by witnessing the state of a pious man and receiving the emanation of his light as a result of his companionship and presence. And then there are times when faith comes by the concurrence of circumstance. Indeed, a Bedouin came to the Prophet ﷺ denying and disavowing him, but when his eyes fell upon his radiant aspect, may Allah increase its dignity and nobility, he saw in it the light of prophethood and exclaimed, by Allah, this is not the face of a liar. He then implored the Prophet ﷺ to explain Islam to him, and immediately embraced it. And this is really important for us to know. So that's all he really says there about belief. He keeps it very, very simple in his breakdown of the Fard Ayn. Now, I think you could add to that it is very good to learn the 13 attributes that we attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's very helpful. And the reason that it's helpful for a number of reasons, but I've been in interfaith gatherings where the moderator would ask each person who is representing a different religion to give a basic understanding of what they believe about Allah, about God. And you would be so surprised. Oh my God. I was like listening to what some of these people were saying. It's just like so confused and convoluted and just not making any sense and all over the place. Whereas like, look at how beautifully you could talk about our Lord. So simply, Allah exists. He has no beginning. He has no end. He's one. He's absolutely independent. He's absolutely different from His creation, subhanahu wa ta'ala. He has the attribute of life, knowledge, will, power. He's all-seeing, all-hearing, and He has the attribute of speech. That's it. Perfect, crystal clear, unadulterated creed that we've transitioned into the modern world unlike any other religion, let alone philosophy or ideology on the face of this earth, with it perfectly intact, as hundreds of thousands and millions and now in the billions of people before us back to the Prophet ﷺ had the same creed that we learned ultimately from that Rasulullah and the revelation that came to him in the book of Allah and the Sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ. The ulama preserved it for us and summarized it in that way. Imam al-Ghazali has this beautiful section in the Maqsad al-Asna, his commentary on the 99 Noons, that shows how all of the other attributes stem from these 13. These 13 necessary attributes, as they're called. And what a blessed deen. Khalas. You learn that, you've learned the essence of what it is that you need to know. And then you say that I believe in all of the other attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has. That's it. So then he says, وَأَمَّا الْفِعْلِ, as for the things that we have to do, بأن يعيش من دعوة النهار إلى وقت الظهر. So if someone started to learn that from that period of time in the mid-morning when they first became Muslim, but then they die before Dhuhr, they die in the best state of all. If Dhuhr comes in, فيتجدد عليه بدخول وقت الظهر تعلم الطهارة والصلاة. So if Dhuhr comes in, then he has to learn how to pray. And he has to learn how to purify himself for prayer. But again, be easy on people. Don't be complicated. Don't make things complicated on people. Be easy on people. At the basic level, you can teach them wudu in like a minute or two. Don't confuse them with all the details. Don't confuse them with all the different times you have to wipe your ears in the Shafi school. Right? Don't confuse them with even doing it 3 times. Just give them the basics. Show them that you just put water on your face, your arms, you wipe over your head, and you wipe your khalas. At the most basic level. And then over time, you teach them a little bit more. Keep it easy. And that some of the masail that are daqiqa, don't even bring these up. You don't need to. Just keep it simple. And then slowly add. We don't want there to be a disconnect between their growth outwardly and inwardly. We want both to be nurtured simultaneously. Now, فإن كان صحيحا وكان بحيث لو صبر إلى زوال الشمس لم يتمكن من تعلم في الوقت بل يخلو ويشتغل بالتعلم. Now, so that's a more of a detailed thing there. And he does say though, that he brings up this question, is it an obligation for them to learn this before the time comes in or after the time comes in? He says that it seems like, and this is the beauty of the ulama, especially in the older books, that aren't so focused, and I don't want to criticize, but sometimes obsessed with what's the dominant opinion. They're very fair when they understand something's ijtihadi. If it's based upon ijtihad, i.e. that the scholarly process of extrapolating the details from the Quran and the Sunnah, then they have to be fair in saying that this is also possible. So he says it appears that this is an obligation once the time of Dhuhr comes in. He says, it is possible to say that learning the obligations of this knowledge is a condition of that knowledge that you need to learn before the action, so that you would say then that it's an obligation before the time comes in. But according to what he said, is that this becomes an obligation when the time enters. فَنْعَاشِ إِلَى Ramadan. If this person lives to Ramadan, tajaddad. So you see this word here, yani, it's not an obligation until Ramadan comes. So there's this idea of tajaddud. So learning the fard ayn, yes, you can learn at the basic level in 2 hours. But if a new circumstance arises, then there's something that you have to now learn. So if one would live to Ramadan, then what happens is, now they have to learn about Ramadan, how to fast. But you could teach someone how to fast Ramadan in less than 5 minutes. It's very easy. You just start fasting at this time, don't eat or drink or do the other things, and khalas. Maintain your fast until Maghrib, that's it. Less than 5 minutes, that was like 10 seconds. It's so easy. It's more about doing it and doing it with presence of heart. وَهُوَ أَنْ يَعْلَمْ أَنَّ وَقْتُ مِنَ الصُّبْحِ إِلَى غُرُوبِ الشَّمْسِ. To know that the time for Ramadan, you'd be surprised. Especially with new converts, we have to be very gentle with people, and that oftentimes people don't know, especially if they converted far away from communities and people are not there to help them, and they didn't understand that it actually was from dawn as opposed to that sunrise. There are people that commonly think that it's sunrise. These things are common. So we need to teach people gently. And then he says you need to teach them about the importance of the intention and what it is that you have to refrain from. And that all this is done until you see the moon of Shawwal and khalas. So he said that then there could be another instance. فَإِن تَجَدَّ لَهُ مَالٌ أَوْ كَانَ لَهُ مَالٌ عِنْدَ بُلُوغِهِ. Then if someone has some type of wealth, so they become Muslim and then they acquire wealth, or they come of age and they have wealth before they become of age, their father or guardian has to do it on their behalf. then they have to learn what to do with that wealth as it relates to zakah. Okay? He says, but وَلَكَنْ لَا يَلْزَمُ فِي الْحَالِ. They don't have to immediately learn that, because depending upon the type of wealth that they have, they will often have to wait an entire year before they have to pay their zakat with certain conditions, so they don't have to learn it right away. And he says that if he doesn't have any type of livestock, then there's no reason you don't have to learn those rulings of zakat on livestock. If you only have one type, you only have to learn zakat on the type of wealth that you actually have. Again, by way of individual obligation. If you want to reach a point where you're a scholar in helping people, then of course you're going to learn more. He says, and then if the months of Hajj enter, he goes through this same process. Okay, so really the rule here is, in terms of the things that we have to, where there's fi'l that you have to do, they become an obligation when the circumstances change. So if someone wants to get married, then you have to learn the basics of that, how to get married. If someone wants to do some form of financial transaction, then you have to learn what are the rulings behind that financial transaction. So the fard ayn is really the ilm al-hal. What you have to learn of what is obligatory, in relation to what the obligatory actions that you have to do, learning how to do them and the time to do them. And then there's also a part of this is what is called turuk, things that we have to leave. And he says, again, is this yatajaddad? This is renewed based upon one's particular state. So there are certain things that we have to know how to avoid. And these things could be things that on our physical limbs, just as these could be things that relate to our hearts. And so that we have to learn a basic knowledge of the halal and the haram. A basic knowledge. We have to know that it's impermissible to drink intoxicating substances. We have to know that it's impermissible to steal someone's things. We have to know that these things that we all know. And essentially it's just, what do we have to avoid with the eye? What do we have to avoid with the ear, with the tongue, the hands, stomach, the private region, and our feet, our 7 limbs. And it's actually not that hard. You can study this in a very short period of time. And then the state of our heart. And this is one of the key features of this, is how Imam al-Ghazali emphatically includes the heart as a part of someone's fard ayn, which it seems so clear, but oftentimes that this wasn't clear before Imam al-Ghazali finally put the stamp on this, such that post Imam al-Ghazali, this is in almost every book of fard ayn, expanding the different schools of thought. They include the various states of the heart. And this relates to, what are the traits of heart that we have to leave? And when it comes to fard ayn, they're the 4 that we mentioned earlier. Is that these are the main ones they mentioned. Learning to avoid riya, ostentation, hasad, envy, kibr, arrogance, and ujub, which is conceit. These are the 4. Because if you can get cured of those 4, the others are easy to overcome. And just as they say, like your tongue, if you can get in control of your tongue, it's easier to get control of your remaining limbs. And so there are obligations that relate to the heart. So to summarize what it is that he is saying here, is the obligations are to learn the basics of what we believe, the basics of what it is that we need to do outwardly by way of worship, and the basics of how we need to be internally in our hearts, and then the basics of the halal and the haram. That's in general. So if you're going to give a more detailed exposition other than what Imam al-Ghazali says here, that's the fard ayn. That's what everybody has to know at the most basic level. And then you expand on it from there. And likewise, when it comes to the heart, if someone doesn't have a problem with certain diseases of the heart, then they're not required to learn how to become purified from them. You have to focus on that what it is that one has an issue with. So that's the Fard Ain. Are there any questions about the Fard Ain before we move to the Fard Kifaya? The Fard Kifaya section is actually very brief, but his approach here is life-changing, where we only to realize what he presents us. Any questions briefly on the Fard Ain?
Could we say there's four which are the sicknesses which are fard to get rid of? Could we say the same about the four states to have obligatory to attain sabr, shukr, or is it not?
So it doesn't seem like that. Yeah, I think they usually focus more. They in the broader conception of it, they do mention those, right? But I think at the basic level, in the heart, the focus is more on, yeah, exactly what you have to rid yourself of. But I think you could very easily say that yani, with a slightly broader definition, that you could include that. So Shaykh Amin is referring to the positive traits of the heart. Is that considered to be a part of the Fard Ain? And that oftentimes you'll find them that focusing on the things not to have, but it is likely that could also be seen as something that needs to be a part of the individual obligations, are the virtues of the heart that you're supposed to have, right? And for instance, in Ibn Ashur, he includes as a part of the Fard Ain an understanding of what are called the maqamat al-yaqeen, the stations of certainty, which are repentance, hope, fear, patience, gratitude, detachment, trust in Allah, love, and then contentment. So I would say that maybe at the very first level, you kind of just focus on and then if you want to expand, then you would kind of move into the various virtues of the heart and so forth, which unquestionably are important, but is it necessarily an obligation to learn? I think that's really that. Yeah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now, Allah. Taib. So, any questions on the Fard Ain?
When you mentioned it's an obligation for parents to prepare their children before puberty, by preparation, did you mean that it's an obligation for them to know it all before puberty, or preparation in the sense that we equip them with the skills so that when they get to puberty, they're now ready to start studying these things? I just want to clarify things.
So, meaning that they have the necessary knowledge to be able to do the amal, the right action, that is an obligation upon them after puberty, right? And at the same time, with some things, like prayer and fasting, you've accustomed them to it, right? So, when you read these books, and this is mentioned in the translation that Sayyid Abdulaziz Fredericks did on the Nadam of Riyadat al-Subyan, it's an obligation upon parents to help their children start praying from an early age, right? It begins at age 7. It's not an obligation on the child, it's an obligation on the parent to start and do the process, right? And you're supposed to start from age 7, gently, lovingly encouraging them to start praying now. And this is really our, we have to be creative in our time and create a nice, beautiful, warm environment in doing things like, doing nice things for them, when they do prayer consistently, and making it fun for them, having it be nice family time where you're very happy and smiling after, something where they start to fly. But if it's just kind of like, hey, pray, rah, 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 and you're just like, harsh and frowning all the time, this type of thing, it's like, why would they want to come pray with you, right? When they could be out doing whatever on the street. And so it's more really creating that uplifting environment at home and going out of your way. That in addition, the knowledge component is not hard to give them, but it's more about really conditioning them, in that way. And then once they reach age 10, now it's time for discipline if they don't, right? Light discipline, right? But again, you've already planted the seeds before, and if we do it right, they naturally, this is why you see 2-year-olds, like they just see their parents, they just come up next to them and like, they're like on their head or whatever, but they're learning. And they'll naturally, very easy, if we do it right and we don't mess it up. The problem is that we mess up the fitrah on our kids because of our own issues that we have. So. Mm-hmm.
Is it appropriate for a brother to teach a convert sister things like rules of prayer? Because I've had a convert sister asking, she's unsure how to pray, how to make all.
Yeah. So is it appropriate for a brother that teach a convert sister that how to pray? All the situations, the situation differs for each person, right? And it's not an unconditional yes or an unconditional no. And certainly if there's no one else to teach the sister and it's done in an appropriate way, in an appropriate context, and that one is protecting himself from any fitna, of course it would be permissible with those conditions that were mentioned. Is that the best way? If there's someone else from amongst the sisters that can be more up close and help her up closely, that is likely better. Or it could be a combination of the two in a more formal setting of learning, and the other sisters teach her kind of the more details of how to actually do some of the things that relate to the specifics of females in prayer and so forth. But the important thing is to look at the situation and to see, and don't get yourself in a situation where you could have done something better. I'll kind of leave it at that. Okay, so let's just move on to this. We have a few minutes left to briefly cover what he talks about fard kifaya. Now this word kifaya is really interesting. That the word kifaya can mean sufficiency. And what's amazing here is that there's a double meaning there. There's sufficiency insofar as there are some people doing it, whereas the responsibility is taken off all the shoulders of the other. But also part of the fard kifaya, as we'll see what Imam al-Ghazali says here, is that there's sufficiency. Here more like ghina, is that sufficiency meaning that when we understand the broad nature of communal obligations, it's for the community to flourish and thrive and to be sufficient. So it takes on both meanings. And it's a really powerful reality of our deen. And so the fard kifaya, if you would speak about it in a legal manner, are obligations that are communally obligatory. Meaning one or some, depending upon what we're talking about here, people have to do this. And if those communal obligations remain unfulfilled, those who had the ability to do them will be held accountable before Allah for not doing them. And so this is really important. And we'll tie this in shortly to that career tracks and the way we hope things will become in these lands in which we live. But let's look at his definition. He says, as for the fard kifaya, the communal obligations, فهو كل علم لا يستغنى عنه في قوام أمور الدنيا. It is any knowledge that you cannot do without in order to establish the affairs of the world. قوام الدنيا, to establish your worldly life. Because we tend to think of religion only having an otherworldly, that our Prophet came for our ma'ash and our ma'ad. To rectify our livelihood, to give us principles for our livelihood, our worldly lives, and the hereafter, of course. Our deen regulates every aspect of our life, which is beautiful, and then allows us to flourish. So here he's saying anything that is needed for a society to run is considered to be from the fard kifaya. And now look at the example he's mentioned. He doesn't even go into the religious sciences yet. He says qattib, he says like medicine. He said this is necessary in order for that physical bodies to remain healthy. He said like hisab, mathematics, is a fard kifaya, because this is needed for various types of dealings and interactions that it is that we have with people. He said that were there to be in any particular place, there not to be a mathematician who can do that basic mathematical computations. were there not to be a doctor, is that all of the people in that village would be sinful. SubhanAllah. And he says, فَلَا يُتَعَجَّبْ مِنْ قَوْلِنَا. Don't be amazed by me saying that medicine and mathematics are from the communal obligations. فَإِنَّ أُصُولَ الصِّنَاعَاتِ أَيْضًا مِنْ فُرُوضِ الْكِفَايَاتِ. The foundational crafts also are from the communal obligations, like agriculture, like weaving, like he says, bel al-hijama, even cupping, to like drive the point home, even cupping. And so him saying this means everything that we need for the society to run is considered to be a communal obligation. So it's a very easy definition. And he went all the way from cupping, from tib, which is clear, everybody knows that, to cupping, and everything in between, including a discussion of mathematics, that all of the crafts that are needed, right? How are you going to have clothes if you don't have that, if you don't have tailors? How are you going to if you don't have industry of some sort that have glasses and that items and kitchenware and things of this? All these things are considered to be communal obligations. Now, what this does is this empowers us to be able to approach every single aspect of our life from the standpoint of deen. So, one of the major problems of our time is what you can call the compartmentalization of religion, where religion is just a part of someone's life. It's just this one part of my life. And people think that I can do this or I can do that, and it doesn't have anything to do with deen. And there's a lot of our fellow brothers and sisters that fall into this pitfall because they don't have the requisite knowledge of how to interact with people in these various areas, right? Of that, whether it be finance or whether it be that the corporate world of some sort. And so what Imam al-Ghazali is saying here is that these are all communal obligations. So just imagine if we could train young people as they are becoming educated, as they're preparing themselves for a particular livelihood. And working is not from the dunya. This is another problem that people have. They what you're doing is just dunya. If someone goes to work and their intention is to take care of their family, or even if they don't have a family, to not be in a need of asking people for something, they get a reward of an obligatory act for every single moment they're at work. Every single moment you're at work, it's ibadah. And then on top of that, if you make an intention by doing the work that it is that you're doing to fulfill a fard kifaya, you also get the reward of a fard kifaya for every single moment that you are at work. And so unfortunately, we've kind of bought into this understanding that if you don't get a degree from this university and get this type of job where you can move up in the corporate ladder and receive this type of salary, it's as if that you are not really working and you're dumb and useless. This is ridiculous, yani. And that it was very clear what was always considered to be the best way of earning a living traditionally. The point here is that imagine raising a whole new generation where they approach their career. Everybody has to work. Everybody has to have livelihood. But they approach it from the standpoint of what is needed for the community. Now, that doesn't negate their own interests, but it's just matching them together so that one person covers one area, someone else covers another area, someone else covers another area. So if we could find people that are steeped in this knowledge of the deen, understand very well the different types of jobs and careers that are out there, this could really, for lack of a better word, empower the upcoming generation to get out of this dichotomy of this deen dunya type thing where there's purposeful work in a way of earning livings done right in a lawful manner, and at the same time you're bringing about benefit and you have purpose for what you're going to work. this would be life-changing. As opposed to simply choosing your career because you didn't have a choice to do anything else, or that you just want to maximize the amount of money that you want to get. So this is really important, but this all ties in with his understanding of Fard Kifaya. This opens up the door for us then to have our line of work, and there's very few things that are actually outside that of the Fard Kifaya. There's very few things, and we can talk more about that in the interactive session, inshallah ta'ala. But this is really empowering and really, really important. And it shows how, through proper knowledge, every single aspect of your life can be ibadah, including your work. And far from most people in the world let their work define them. Here it's the opposite. Now that you are allowing yourself to have your work be a part of the religious life, where it's actually then muqarrab bil Allah and brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq and give us an understanding of this deen, and bless us to be aware of our personal obligations, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen, as well as the communal. May Allah ta'ala bring these understandings alive in our communities so that we are purposeful and we put everything in its proper place, and as a result then have impact upon people that are around us. Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
وجد بالنوال منه إليّ